this is Jim Schwab, manager of the APA Hazards Planning Center, and I'm at the 2015 Natural Hazards Workshop. With me is Jack Kartez, who is a longtime professor of community planning at the University of Southern Maine's Muskie School of Public Affairs, and he is also the director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 1 Environmental Finance Center, which raises some interesting issues, including, first, what is the Environmental Finance Center? What does it do?
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here. The Environmental Finance Center program is a small, innovative program of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that was spearheaded by a former comptroller of EPA, who saw that there was an overlooked problem in the nation's addressing of its environmental needs, which was the question of how are we going to pay for these environmental improvements. So this was initiated as a university-based center program so that there would be a way to tap into knowledge and resources at our universities in the country, and each of EPA's 10 regions could designate at least one environmental finance center. There's a region that has two of them and has for some years. So bit by bit, the various regions of EPA across the country began to get these environmental finance centers, which were advocated by the regional administrator in each region. So the environmental finance centers provide a link between EPA and the local government level, especially, although we also work with state agencies as well, because sometimes it's hard for EPA to make that connection. And the focus is on this question of how do we pay for environmental improvements of all kinds. Environmental finance and where it's going in the future is an emerging need. And what I'm going to do is tell you very briefly about some of the existing needs, how they relate to hazard mitigation planning, and then to climate adaptation planning, which we've been talking about quite a bit here at the 40th Annual Hazards Workshop here in Boulder. So, for example, the nation's number one water quality problem right now is stormwater management. Localities and states, but particularly the local level, the first line of defense has to figure out how are they going to pay for the minimum control measures required under the NPDES Phase 2 provisions of the Clean Water Act, which have been expanded over the last 10 to 15 years. One innovation has been stormwater utilities, where the producers, the landowners, both residential and commercial industrial, who produce impervious surfaces that create runoff and stormwater, have to help pay for the measures that will be implemented to manage that stormwater. So this just isn't a matter of pollution control and water quality. Obviously, increased precipitation, which we've been experiencing, leads to increased intensity, duration, and volumes of runoff, and that leads to flooding hazards of both what we call the everyday type, which creates small problems but kind of add up over time to really significant flooding. So that's an example. It's using existing tools such as fees or property tax surcharges, but in an innovative way. So another example of innovations in environmental finance that are beginning to emerge is the City of Berkeley's FIRST program. It was Financing Initiative for Renewable Solar Technology. In 2008, the City of Berkeley Council created a revenue bond that would provide upfront funds for landowners, including residential landowners primarily, to be able to invest immediately in putting solar voltaic electrical generation systems on their roofs. And the revenue bond provided a mechanism for each of these landowners who invested in this technology to be able to pay it back over time with a mortgage-like instrument. So actually it didn't use public funds except for a little while because it was leveraging private funds. First was copied by Palm Springs, and it's over now. They've used up all their money. It was their objective as cities, both Palm Springs and the City of Berkeley, to electrify and create renewable energy sources. It's been copied by other cities across the country. At the time when Berkeley did this in 08-09, Climate Solutions, NGO that's very deeply involved in trying to push the implementation of new technology and renewable energy infrastructure, said This kind of innovation at the local level is going to be absolutely vital. We can't have enough of it. We're going to have to try to promote it in some fashion. So, in the hazards management area, which we're here, of course, this week focusing on, financing has largely, historically, been the federal government coming in the past after a disaster, and now through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Section 404 program of the Stafford Act and the Disaster Management Act later in 2000, it's possible to do some upfront hazard mitigation planning. Now we have the impact of a non-stationary climate. In the climate change arena, we talk about how stationarity is dead because the basic parameters of the climate, average temperature, average durations and intensity of precipitation, and many other types of characteristics of the climate are changing. The basic measurements of the climate are shifting, and they're creating more intense hazards. So it's forcing us to go beyond this historical model that you're so familiar with at APA, Jim, in your program and the center, of waiting for the federal government to go ahead and fund something, usually after the event, where hazard mitigation planning can be upped with more money if you have a hazard mitigation plan, but also before the event. In order to adapt to the shifting hazards, the intensifying hazards coming with a non-stationary climate, or what's commonly referred to as climate change and global warming, it is going to be necessary, in particular, to deal with the big ticket items of infrastructure, which are going to have the biggest payoff in terms of creating resilience and the ability to adapt to the shocks that are going to be coming in the future. And that includes hard gray infrastructure as well as green and natural infrastructure. It's all infrastructure. New York City's Green Bond Bank is another example of an innovation, but New York City's big. Cities like New York and Chicago have already made the decision that they're going to try to cover their roofs and buildings with solar, with rain gardens and green roofs and lots of other things, but they're but two of the 10,000 municipalities in the United States and a little over 3,000 counties. Last year, our sister Environmental Finance Center in Region 3 at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, held a forum, a very high-level forum on the future of environmental finance. It included city and county officials, the mayor of Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, state agency leaders, business leaders from the finance community, the bonding community, Citibank, as well as Stan Meeberg, who's now the deputy administrator of the USEPA and has long been involved in helping to support and guide the environmental finance program. Among the conclusions of this very high-level forum, and you can get to it by just Googling UNC EFC, and you'll find it. It's called Emerging Themes in Environmental Finance, Results of a Forum, 2014. Number one, the future is not going to be the same as the past. We're going to have to deal with a very new landscape. Number two, innovation is going to be crucial. It has to be promoted, particularly at the local level. And with respect to that, number three, small distributed solutions are going to be vital, but there's going to be challenges. One example of the conflicts that are emerging, for example, is that large electric utilities are not entirely happy as small distributed, dispersed, decentralized solar photovoltaic energy producers on residential and commercial property are trying to send energy back into the grid. So there's a lot that we need to work out in that regard. And then I'll just mention a fourth of perhaps a dozen different findings from this very important forum on the future of environmental finance. Public-private partnerships, or what we call P3 at USEPA, is important, but there are going to be new partnerships that have to be developed as innovations as well, and sometimes they're going to involve very unlikely partners. But I can tell you one thing for sure. As a planner for the last 45 years, starting out my career in Oregon with the statewide planning program and some localities in Washington and Idaho as well, the local level that we work with in the planning profession is the first line of defense, and it also, in many ways, even though it's a challenge in terms of the resource availability and all the demands on our communities, it is going to be one of the first lines of defense for innovation, and it already has been.
Great. So you're really at the front end of an issue that I referred to in the plenary this morning.
I am.
Of how we integrate this climate change data and information into capital improvements programming so that we can have better defenses against natural hazards.
I think that's exactly right, Jim, and I'm happy to see that this program has been built up in the hazards arena at APA because now it can also transition to and bridge to the climate change arena. Let me give you an example of local and state partnership that's led to innovation in our region in New England. Connecticut, Department of Environmental Protection, and ICLEI, the local government sustainability organization that's been around for about 15 years now, I believe, 300 U.S.
Right.
members. They partnered to develop a pilot program, and they used Groton, Connecticut, which is a coastal city, of course, as kind of their test bunny. And among the things that Groton has done, which they now use as a training model throughout Connecticut with a climate adaptation planning toolkit, is that they integrated this, just what you're talking about, into their capital improvements programming. So that has been a very useful instance of progress on this.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a
Great pleasure.
wonderful
Thank you very
interview.
much.
Thank you.